today I'm talking about conceptual engineering at a pretty high level of abstraction. So it's going to be, and there are really, I think, two ways to think about conceptual engineering, and my preference to some extent is one where we start with a lot of particular cases and we think carefully about the details of those cases. So those of you who have heard me talk about the latest political project about political terminology will have heard, I think there's just so much richness in each particular case study that it isn't very helpful to start with just a very general theory. But despite all of this, today you will get something that's just a very high level abstract description of an issue that I think comes up quite a lot. And it's got to do with the way in which these topics in conceptual engineering, or the activity of conceptual engineering, both theoretical and in practical life, tends to create a form of linguistic fragmentation. And part one of the talk, I will try to describe these forms of fragmentation. And the goal is here to do it, as I said, without getting bogged down too much in particular cases. So it'd be very good, actually, if in Q&A we could talk through, do the whole thing, just going through examples. But I won't be doing it so much. I'll give you some cases as we go along, but it'll be a very high level. Then part two, having outlined the ways in which these fragmentations can happen, I'll talk about ways in which we can ameliorate that fragmentation if it needs amelioration, which is an open question. Maybe it's a good thing. And I'll get to that at the very end, where I talk about avoidance, where we just avoid each other, and maybe it turns out avoidance actually is a good thing. So that's the plan. And one more preliminary thing, maybe it's a bit insider-ish, this talk. I think that it's easier to get what I'm saying if you have some familiarity with these issues and the different frameworks from before, because it does presuppose quite a bit. Okay, so the idea is that we get a certain types of fragmentation as a result of these processes that can be described as the result of conceptual engineering, be it theoretical or non-theoretical. And they come in two forms, I will suggest. A lot of what I'm going to do today is just suggest. There won't be a massive amount of argumentations. It's going to vary this field of just taxonomy and giving a structure to a field. So I'm going to suggest, rather than argue, that they fall into two kinds, these fragmentations. The one type is when there's a common linguistic item, an expression, and that expression is used with different meanings, and the difference is quite significant. That generates one kind of fragmentation. And then there is another kind of fragmentation that happens when the engineering project has concluded certain terminologies should be abandoned. When you get one group abandoning an expression and another group preserving that expression, that creates fragmentation as well. So those are the two kinds of fragmentations, and they'll raise somewhat different types of problems, and I'll talk about each of them in more detail. Okay, so let's start with the first kind of fragmentation. So for those of you who are a bit familiar with that book I wrote called Fixing Language, it was very focused on cases where there's a particular lexical item, like belief, for example, the word belief, the English word, and where you can see in the philosophical tradition and maybe outside philosophy that speakers will want to and maybe even do use it with different meanings. There can be two kinds of differentiation when you talk about a particular lexical item, and when you think that two groups are using it with different meanings, all depending on the kind of meaning that you're interested in. In the book Fixing Language, my focus is very much on semantic differences. So the idea would be that you've got this one lexical item, one group, it could be just one person, but it could be a larger group, wants to use E with a certain meaning, M1, and another group wants to use it with another meaning, M2. Wants to is tendentious here, I'm getting to that later. Sometimes these differences will be insignificant. The insignificant cases, I think, are ubiquitous. There's going to be these kinds of differences because of context sensitivity. So when people find themselves in different contexts, they'll use words with slightly different meanings, but it won't make much of a difference. So there's going to be the insignificant ones. I'm not interested in those. Then there's going to be some cases that are significant, but where, let's just use belief again, even though I don't want anything to hang on that particular case, where you've got one group using one meaning, another with another meaning, but there's some kind of continuity between the two meanings, and where that is in some sense a totally theory neutral at this point, topic preserving. So they're both talking about belief, and we can class them together in some relevant and significant way. What I really care about in this talk is when there isn't continuity of that kind. So it's significant and it's not topic preserving. That's when you get the kind of fragmentation that I'm interested in. Now, as much of the literature commenting on, or other people not commenting on, but just independently thinking about conceptual engineering, have focused instead of speaker meaning. So that leaves open the possibility that we have the same semantic content, but in some sense of speaker meaning, the speakers think that the terms are have one meaning. This group thinks it has meaning M1, and this group thinks it has meaning M2. Again, that could be communicatively insignificant. It could be significant but topic preserving, but I'm interested in the cases where it's significant and not topic preserving. So that's a little structure for how the kind of meaning divergence you get when you want to share a lexical item that have different meanings assigned to it can create fragmentation. So I told you this would be very taxonomical. So it's just for me to try to think through all the different ways this could happen. So some of this could happen accidentally, but it could also be intentional. It could be accidental, especially the speaker meaning thing would probably happen accidentally quite often, all depending on what you think speaker meaning is and what you think belief about meaning or thinking that it means something is. That notion is fairly individualistic and will vary quite a bit, so you get a lot of it. You might get these semantic differences depending on how you think about more foundational issues there, and especially when you have context-sensitive language. So it could happen accidentally, but it could also, and this is the more interesting case, but not the only interesting case, I think both of them are quite interesting actually, is when it's intentional. So if you have some philosophers who think very hard about the term belief and they're confident that the current meaning is the wrong one and they want to use it in a different way. Term family, people who think very carefully about what they think should be in the extension of family, what it ought to mean, and then another group would do equal kind of thinking and they diverge. So here, maybe an easy case to think about is a very socially conservative use of the term family that excludes a lot of the things that most of us would think of as family versus, and it could be an intentional insistence that that's what should be in the meaning. And now we're just going to bracket the issue, whether it's semantics or speaker meaning. And then another group has got an alternative view. So those are two ways this could happen, intentional and partly overlapping, but not entirely with the previous distinction, is that there could be awareness of this difference versus non-awareness. So in the family case, again, I think illustrates this. Some people will be very aware of the difference in certain settings and in certain conversations, while others, in other settings, the difference can be there, but the participants in the conversation will be unaware of it. So I hope that that's clear. It could happen in a case where it's both that this part only partially overlaps with the intentional versus non-intentional. Even if it's intentional, you might not be aware that the other one has an intentional meaning that's different from yours. And the nature of the difference between you and the communicative problems that will occur is affected to some extent by awareness versus non-awareness. Okay, so what happens when we have these differences, and in particular, the ones that are significant, not topic, continuous, intentional, or something we're not aware of? It's going to be too complicated to do all of them in detail, but I'll give you get a sense of what, I hope you get a sense of what applies to what here. So the first thing that's breaking down is homophonic interpretation. So if you utter a sentence S with the word family in it, I can't just interpret you as having said, and then I use the same sentence. So I'm going to have to use some kind of translation manual. And this happens whether it's semantic or at the speaker meaning level. And corollary of that is, if I want to say to others what you've said, I will be unable to do it in this homophonic way. Now, so homophonic just means reusing the same words, because I can no longer assume that your words mean the same as mine. So we have, and so that will lead to a mistake consistently. You might think doesn't always matter, but remember I said there's going to be cases where it really matters, and so that's the cases to really focus on. Now, this isn't always a big problem, because if you're aware of it, if you know the translation manual, so to speak, we'll talk more about translation manuals later, but if you know that how to do that, but you can already see how this is going to be cognitively taxing if you're aware of it. The translation, homophonic interpretations are so smooth and hardwired into us when we share a language, but then suddenly now you have a shared language, but there is a breach in it, there's a crack, and homophony breaks down. It's not insurmountable, we're used to it, but it is very hard and it requires work. And of course, for those who are not aware, there is persistent miscommunication because they'll persist in these homophonic interpretations and reports. And then you get communicative breakdowns. So this is one of the problems that part 2 of this talk is meant to try to solve. What do we do about this? Which I think indisputably happens, and it happens I think there are many theories now about what conceptual engineering is, what it operates on, what the results are, and so on. But this kind of thing is going to happen quite often. I'll talk about how often later. Okay, so that was the type 1 breakdown. So I'm going to talk about type 2 breakdown, which might not be as familiar to everyone, but some of you might have heard me talk about abandonment in an earlier talk. That's like my new project, because in fixing language, I spent a lot of time thinking about preservation of lexical item, and then evolution of meaning, differences in meaning, ameliorations of meaning, and so on. But the focus there wasn't on thinking about the meaning of a term and then deciding that the term should just be abandoned. But I've now been quite interesting lately in more recent work in what happens when we just get rid of language. And looking through the history of this, I think it happens just incredibly much. But it's different from the first group, because because what's happening is not preserving the lexical item and disagreeing about the meaning. What happens is you want to preserve the lexical item, I want to get rid of it. And so the most immediate case, though it's special in many ways, slurs. There are going to be people who, I mean, we never meet them in philosophy seminars, but there definitely are people who use slurs all the time, even the worst slurs. So they presumably think that should be part of their lexicon, while we think it shouldn't be. Other cases, I think religious cases are quite good. People whose worldviews are deeply immersed in certain religious frameworks will use terms like blasphemy. I'm going to give this case from Oscar Wilde later. And of course, the enormous amount of terminological paraphernalia that's religious that the people who are not religious just don't use, and because they find them, they've rejected that terminology. I've been thinking quite a bit about political terminology lately, and one area I think here to think about is that for centuries, hundreds of years, going back millennia, the idea of nobility and aristocracy, and that of being noble, not in the sense of, just being a prince or princess or something. That's not the sense, but the deep sense of nobility that was the theoretical underpinning of aristocracy. Okay, so that term, I think you will notice that when you now read political philosophy, it isn't really taken seriously at all. It's not, you just don't find anything but historical work that appeals to that notion of nobility as the foundation of, or even relevant to, policy making or collective decision making. Okay, so those are examples of cases where terminology has been rejected. There's going to be, so I'm happy to talk more about that for those of you who are interested in science, in ordinary life, where terminology is left behind. Okay, so I hope that's clear enough. So we have cases where one group wants to preserve terminology and the other group wants to reject it. So when that happens, I already have some cases here, but let me go to my favorite example of this. My favorite example is one of the trials of Oscar Wilde. This is the trial that Wilde started. He was the one suing. But during it, the defense attorney, Edward Carson, this exchange is terrific. So sorry for those of you who heard this before, but I'll read it for those who haven't. Carson said, in questioning Oscar Wilde on the stand, he said, "Do you think the story blasphemous?" And Wilde said, "I think it violated every artistic canon of beauty. But I wish to know whether you thought the story blasphemous." Wilde says, the story filled me with disgust. The ending was wrong. Answer the question, sir. Did you or did you not consider the story blasphemous? I thought it disgusting. And it goes on a little bit. And Carson says, you know that when the priest in the story administers poison to the boy, he uses the words of the sacrament of the Church of England. I entirely forgot. And do you consider that blasphemous? I think it's horrible. Blasphemous is not a word of mine. So that's an abandonment. So this is Oscar Wilde saying, look, I just cannot use that term. I'm not going to answer your question because it isn't one of my words. I can quote it, but I'm not going to use it. And so you get, and this exchange is very interesting because there's a lack of conversational cooperation. And initially, when you think about it, it looks like it's from Oscar Wilde. Like he's just refusing to answer the question. But on the other hand, it's a completely legitimate strategy for someone who has rejected the term blasphemy. It takes a few sentences, and maybe Carson, maybe he should have said this earlier, but he wants to say, you cannot ask me that question. This is not a conversation we can have. I cannot cooperate with you in any, so if he had been a Bryce, say, there's no cooperation that's going to lead us down to you getting an answer to your question. And the reason for that is our lexicons don't overlap. And you want me to engage in a cooperative behavior that I cannot do because there is this tool you want to bring along, the word blasphemous, that I refuse to take on. And it's not a weird one-off strange story. I find myself in exactly this situation because I'm someone who genuinely believes that the word intuition, as it's used by philosophers, is gibberish. For me, that's like when Heideggerians talk about nothingness and words like that I don't understand. And I can't, and it's always in seminars, like, was it intuitive? Is that intuitive? Is this more intuitive than that? And we should reject it because it's counterintuitive. Those are not conversations that I can participate in. Every time that comes up, I have to, either I just diverge in this kind of non-cooperative way, which is very annoying for everyone else, or I violate something that I really care about. So there's a cooperative break, and people know that about me. So it's kind of mean that they keep putting me in those situations. Okay, so it's not just that we get these cooperative breakdowns. That's a kind of practical matter. There's also the problem of lost topics. So the person who have abandoned something, that this person is preserving forgiveness, intuitions, nobility, or blasphemy, forgiveness could do this as well. So these people will have a topic they care about, a topic that motivates them, that triggers questions, inquiry, and so on, write books about. And then this group, either just, that's not a topic because it's something they can't engage with. So I describe that as the problem of lost topic. There seems to be a kind of loss on the abolitionist side, but of course the abolitionist thinks it's very bad to have those topics. So they think the loss was good. It's like losing weight or something if you're unhealthy. So there's the loss, and then there's a trade-off, whether that's good or bad. We're going to talk about whether it's good or bad later. Okay, so I've given you these the two ways in which we can get fragmentation, and the effects come in different forms. We get conversational breakdowns, problem of lost topics I just talked about, miscommunication problems, cooperative breakdowns. They come in slightly different flavors depending on whether it's intentional, whether we're aware of it, whether it's semantic or speaker meaning, but that kind of pattern, I think, will show up quite frequently. Instantiations of this will happen. And of course, sometimes it's just one little expression. Sometimes it's a whole deep, all-encompassing set of terminology that's affected. Like in the religious case, to some extent, people who are deeply immersed in the theory of aristocracy and nobility, for example. I mean, it's hard to find those people now, but we can read about them. And having a conversation there would just be very difficult. We'd run into all these difficulties. And then there's us talking to the Heideggerian or the intuition people. So that's the kind of issue that I'm interested in, the fragmentations and the problems that arise in connection with fragmentation. And I know this is a bit vague, it's high level and so on, but I'm trying to make it like that because I don't want it to be tied specifically to the theory I had in fixing language, for example. I want it to be more something everyone can engage with, this sort of issue, which I think is quite interesting to think through. And so before I get to part 2, where I'm going to try to solve these problems, I'll say this is some remarks. So this is just like, here are some things to think about in connection with what I just said. So I'm first going to talk about how much fragmentation is there. Is a really big problem? How is it different from having different beliefs? Should we think of it as good, bad? And what does conceptual engineering have to do with it? Okay, so is this a real problem? Is it just some thought out thing that someone emerged in his literature on conceptual engineering can think of? I really think not. So I think we should expect that different cultures and time periods are likely to be fragmented along these lines. I live in China, and it has a history. There are parts of Chinese intellectual traditions that just seem incredibly different, and where the challenge of bridging is very, very obvious. And that's just like right now. So if we think, and that's just me, I'm basically living in a kind of expat university academic bubble anyway. I think you can just live and notice that. You can live it and notice it in different socioeconomic groups in the United States and Europe, or between other parts of the world. I think that is not just an occasional thing that springs out of Clark and Chalmers saying something about belief or something like that. It's something we should think of as maybe the norm rather than weirdness. And that's connected to the fact that radical differences in belief, like in the religious case, can lead to fragmentation. Same with normative political religious differences. And of course, also some theoretical activities like conceptual engineering can lead to fragmentation, because the more we are intentionally aware of choices we make, both about what lexicon to keep and what meaning particular lexical items should have, the more disagreement, because philosophy always leads to disagreement. It's an essential feature of what we're doing, a good making feature of what we're doing. So we get all these differences, and that will then increase these fragmentations. But I don't think that we conceptual engineers are the source of all of this. I think it's much deeper and much more ubiquitous, but certainly something. Another thing, I wanted to say more about this, but I don't think I have that much time. There's a way in which you can just think of these fragmentations as possible fragmentations. Think of another group that had it. You get a sense of why I think this a little bit later, but you don't really need the real ones in order for all the interesting philosophical questions to come up. You can in many cases just imagine someone who has abandoned or who differs from you in various ways. And then you think, well, would that fragment do better than me? I mean, maybe Matti Eklund's work on alternative normative concepts is a bit like this. It's not as if he knows people who are doing it, he's imagining it. And it is a kind of fragmentation of the kind that I've been talking about. And then all these interesting philosophical questions come up. I hope it's clear that this is different from just having different beliefs. It's clear one way in which groups, people in a community can differ in that this group has certain beliefs, and then this group believes the opposite of what that group thinks, so they disagree. That's the kind of first order disagreement, fragmentation, if you will, that we often are familiar with. We often politically will say there's so much disagreement about these political issues, about taxation. These people think there should be more taxation, and these people think there should be less taxation. Now that's very different from the fragmentation that I've been talking about, because they all, in order for that to be the case, they need to share a notion of taxation and the number system and their measurement. They got to really coordinate a lot in order to disagree on that. I'm imagining an even deeper thing where the thing that this group wants is something this group isn't even talking about. It's a kind of incommensurability. So it's, I think, a much deeper and more interesting fragmentation, or maybe not, but it's at least as interesting form of fragmentation as the fragmentation you get when people in groups have different beliefs. Okay, should we just assume that this is good or bad or a bit of both? Remember, I said now I was just going to give some remarks about this fragmentation before I talk about how to resolve it. I don't think that has an easy answer. It's going to depend a lot on the setting, what's at stake. I've been thinking about these political notions lately about democracy, legitimacy, freedom, and so on. I think if nuclear powers fail to communicate, and then as a result, World War III destroys the known universe, or at least the Earth, that would be really bad. That would be super motivation for trying to be more communicatively constructive. But sometimes nothing is at stake, and then it doesn't really matter. Sometimes I'm going to end with this. Actually, the next slide, I'm going to repeat twice. Sometimes maybe it's not so bad. Here's a way of thinking about how it could be not so bad. So the picture that I have is one where this is not a form of linguistic relativism, or truth isn't relative. My picture is one where there's this world out there. Truth is a monadic property. Propositions, each fragment expresses it's either true or false, simpliciter, relative to that world. And maybe the structure of all of this is such that when we have more of these fragments, many of them, we get more truths about the world. And they give us different cognitive method models for understanding it. And maybe it's not so easy to do both things at the same time. I'm going to talk about switchers later, the people who switch between fragments. But it could be a good thing because you get more truths. And then another maybe corollary of this, or just an additional point, is that maybe the social structures, the collective structures we can have depend on which fragment you're in, so to speak. And if that's the case, then having many fragments leaves room for many kinds of social structures. Maybe some of them are bad, some of them are good, but maybe having a plurality is better than having just one. So that's some reason for thinking maybe not all fragmentation is bad. So let's say just a little bit about fragmentation and humility, which is something I've thought about. But one way to think about humility is as a form of recognition that your beliefs are as respectable as mine. I'm fallible. I shouldn't think of I should be able to both hold the thought in my head that I believe all this, but also that the people who believe other things could be right. That's very difficult, but trying to achieve it is a form of humility. And maybe here's an analog of that. People who occupy a different fragment from you're not going to join them, but thinking of them as not inferior to yours is a kind of fragment humility. You recognize that you occupy a fragment and you ended up there for somewhat contingent reasons. You could have been in this other fragment, and you shouldn't be dissing it all the time. You should respect it. That was part one. For reasons I really don't understand, running out of time, but I'm going to try to speed up. I'm talking too slowly, I think. So I'm going to do my usual fast talking now. Okay, part two. How do we communicate between these fragments? I can think of 4 ways of doing it. Some form of metalinguistic negotiation, the creation of bridge concepts, having people who are switchers, and then charity. And there are different kinds of charity. And if all that fails, we're going to go to avoidance. So we have 2 types of metalinguistic negotiation that could help us. One is the familiar one, and it's what happens when we go to, this is the standard picture where you've got this one lexical item, and there's in some sense, there's use patterns that constitute a negotiation over what the meaning of that expression should be. And there's another kind of negotiation, which is not about the meaning of a particular expression, but about the subset of lexical items that we should include or introduce. So that corresponds to the 2 kinds of fragmentations that I was talking about. And sometimes that's something we could do. Maybe we're doing it without being aware of it. Maybe it happens a lot. I've written about why I'm a little bit skeptical, but it's certainly a view you could hold that this happens quite a bit. It's going to run into trouble sometimes just because there isn't enough shared language to do the negotiation in. That's it. That's the kind of bootstrapping problem you get if the deliberation is above normative terminology, if you have to use normative terminology, or if there's some sort of gibberish language that you don't know how to engage with. Or I think also, again, very useful to think about where this bottoms out to some extent. As Chalmers talks about how we can, when you use the method of elimination, and if you don't know what that is, ask me in Q&A, you reach a bedrock of terms. But one, as Dave notices, one person's bedrock might not be another's. And so that could be a way in which this could fail. So there's quite a bit of literature on this. So that is one strategy. Okay. I mean, there's quite a bit of literature on this. Second strategy, bridge concepts. If negotiations fail, we can try to create concepts that can be shared and that stand in some helpful, relevant similarity relation to the disputed terminology. This can be very difficult. It can be hard to find, very hard to converge on. I mean, it very often happens, by the way, just people who are professional negotiators try to find, like, to write treaties and stuff. They often try to do this, find some like common terminology that the groups can agree on. And it's very hard. And of course, there's a sense of deprivation. Each group will feel deprived to some extent because they feel like, well, what they really cared about that was expressed in this terminology they stick to is being taken away from them. But maybe switchers can help. So I'm interested in switchers. So just like we have people who are So one person can start out as religious or something, and then they develop over time and they change their terminology. So I would often talk about intuitions, and then I stopped at some point. So the different time slices of me were different. But there are people who switch a lot just from one day to the other, they go a bit more back and forth. Those are the switchers. I'm thinking one day they're in one fragment and another day they're in another. So even if the two fragments can't really talk to each other, one individual could move between the two. I know this is very abstract right now. Just imagine this as a possibility. Now we can ask a lot of questions about switchers. I mean, it does seem, of course, it could be very minor, and it's not unhealthy, but it takes a kind of cognitive burden to do this switching, if the different views are deeply held. But it doesn't have to be. Unhealthy is probably the wrong term there. It might be a sign of cognitive flexibility, but there's a sense that if you switch between fragments a lot, there's also a lack of integrity, because there's a sense like being devoted to a particular fragment should be a more stable character trait than something that's just like moving around it, but maybe not. Another interesting question about switchers is, are they dishonest when they switch? Do they have to actually or do they have to change their beliefs in order to switch? And I think they don't really need to either lie or be dishonest. So maybe it's that when they are in fragment one, then fragment one looks better than actually they believe that fragment one is better than fragment two, and then vice versa when they're in fragment two. Now, of course, that raises these questions. How do you move from one fragment to another? There's a lot of interesting things to say about switchers. I could have had the whole talk about switchers, but now we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to do this quickly. We could talk more about it in Q&A. But I do think switchers are interesting because they can help us communicate across fragments, because they participate in the ways of life that support each of the fragments. So insofar as that's a requirement for understanding each fragment, they're cross-fragment understanders. Now that can help them understand it, but it might also be communally helpful because they could help us create bridge concepts. One thing I've been interested in here in Hong Kong is to talk to the people in Chinese philosophy and think about, because my sense is that concepts are so different that we shouldn't prioritize one tradition over the other. And so what we need are bridge concepts. And there, I'm inferior to the people who can switch. Because I think we do have, in a sense, we have switchers here, people who can switch between one fragment, between the one tradition and the other. And they're probably in a better position to create, or much better position to create bridge concepts than someone like me. Okay, so that was switchers. So we've done we're done with the switchers. We're going to now talk about charity. So remember, this part of the talk concerns how we communicate and understand each other across fragments. And I really like a lot of what Appia has to say about this. I don't know if this is his view throughout all his work or not, but I think I'll read this, even though we're running short on time. So he's an abolitionist about the term race, is or was. But he says, even if there are no races, we could use a grasp of the vague criteria for the concept of race in predicting what their thoughts and their talk about race will lead them to do. We could use it to predict what thoughts about races various experiences would lead them to have. Now, I have already declared myself very often on the question of whether I think there are any races. I think there aren't. So it's important that I'm clear that I also believe that understanding how people think about race remains important for these reasons, even though there aren't any races. And then he has an analogy with people who believe in witchcraft. Okay. So Appia, so that's a kind of fragmentation. There's the race abolitionists and the people who use it extensively. And Appia says, well, I want to be able to understand, predict, and so on, these others. We want to understand them. So abstractly, abandonment of the term, wants to understand the people who are preservationists, want to explain their actions, want to predict what thoughts they have about X, given various experiences. They will have given various experiences. Now, I'm worried, so that's a nice picture, and it's a nice goal. And I'm sure something along these lines is very important as a strategy for bridging. But I am a bit worried about the way it's being put. So just to remind, he says we could use the grasp of the vague criteria for the concept race in predicting what their thoughts and their talk about race will lead them to do. Now, I don't think this is a good way to put it. And as someone who's often written favorably about the abandonment of various expressions, I'm very sensitive about that way of talking because he's using the term that he wants to abolish, race, in describing what the abolitionist will do. I mean, if he truly wants to abandon it, then that quoted passage shouldn't really be part of his terminology. So, you know, maybe he's not a complete abolitionist and so on. So that's fine. But just imagine someone who is. That person wouldn't want to say something along those lines. Also, I don't think vagueness has anything to do with it, because vagueness is everywhere. So that's not really the source of any of these concerns. So the focus on vagueness, I'm not so happy with either. And I'm worried about extreme cases. So take the verse slur, the N word. Do we want to use this strategy for those people? We've abandoned that. Now imagine trying to. Oh, sorry, I skipped the slide. But it doesn't matter. I can do this slide first. Imagine trying to do this, the thing that is quoted there, for the N word. I think it's clear you don't want to do that. So there's a real concern here that the strategy doesn't generalize to the worst kinds of cases. So that's one worry. The second worry that was supposed to come first, but it doesn't really matter, is that there's an underlying internalism in this way of thinking about it. It just assumes that despite the emptiness, there's some articulable descriptions, the things he calls the criteria, the vague criteria that captures the meaning of what the speaker had in mind. But I don't think those are just, if you're a broadly Kripkean externalist, those things are just beliefs they had, not things that constitute the meaning of the term in any way. So I think one Kripkean lesson is that this is a flawed strategy that in effect is a form of misinterpretation, because you attribute a meaning content to the speaker. You treat a cluster of beliefs they have as the meaning of a term, which is wrong. So I like it better. Here's the thing I like better. Maybe it's not very different, but as I call it, reconstructive charity. So what we do is we're not attributing to that agent an intelligible content. That was what HKU was trying to do, the vague criteria and so on. And I criticize that. Okay, so don't do that. But what you do is you do this counterfactual. You imagine another interlocutor, which is an improved version of the other one. It's a kind of ameliorated interlocutor. And then you attribute contents to that imaginary interlocutor. So it's a form of intentional miscommunication, but it's better than simple miscommunication because it has the effect of elevating the other agent. So it's charitable. I mean, it's not because I don't treat that agent charitably, but I mean, I'm being nice to him or her or they by creating another agent that I'm sort of talking to. Now, I don't think this is a very good solution always, because some people will get very upset because they want you to talk to them with all their flaws. They don't want you to talk to them because they don't think it's a better version. So it could create trouble. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. So those are the strategies that I think we have. Sometimes there will be no charity, there will be no bridge concepts, there will be no negotiation that works. And then I think the fragments just remain separate. They don't try to talk. 'Cause And that's the complete breakdown in communication, because there's no effort to cooperate. That's avoidance. I think that's what happens if the first strategies, maybe there are more strategies, you can tell me about them, if they fail. But if everything fails, then there's avoidance. Now, just a reminder, maybe avoidance and separation isn't so bad. Maybe avoidance means that we get more truths, because each fragment can pick up on features of the world that the other one couldn't. Maybe we get this plurality of social structures that could be helpful. And there are other things that are in the neighborhood of these two options. There's also, did this get its own slide? No, it didn't. So this point here about integrity, there is a sense, I think, in which there's a kind of purity that each fragment can preserve if they're not trying to engage with radically different fragments. There's maybe a kind of integrity and autonomy that gets diluted to some extent if you spend too much time trying to create bridge concepts and you have too many switchers and things like that. It undermines the maybe unity and internal integrity of each fragment. So maybe sometimes it's okay to have avoidance and separation. It's at least an option that I think is worth exploring. And again, as I said at the very beginning, all of this is far too high a level of abstraction from what I really like. So what we should be doing is thinking about all this instantiated in different cases, and the cases will probably tell us a lot more richly about each of these possibilities. That's it. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.